So, welcome to another episode. It's amazing. I actually get to do something I've always wanted to do, and that is review and look back on the entire Phantasy Star series. It's going to be a big one. Here we go. So the Phantasy Star series is big. It's become huge over the years. And I'm going to start right at the beginning with my favorite game of all time, and that is Phantasy Star 1. To start off with Phantasy Star 1, we had to start by explaining why Phantasy Star 1 came to be. In 1987, the big selling video game in Japan was Dragon Quest II. And basically Sega was saying, hey, we want a role-playing game on our system. So they created a little team, and together they created Phantasy Star 1. And it's basically not medieval, it's a mix between science and medieval, so they have guns and swords and all this kind of stuff. It was a real mix of stuff. It had spaceships, it had all this stuff, and it was an RPG that set a new precedent. It was unbelievable. And it got released in 1988, and it wasn't a huge hit. That was what was sad about Phantasy Star 1, but it set the groundwork for all the rest of these games. So as they say, Phantasy Star was never really a big hit. But the Mega Drive was released in Japan. They needed, some killer apps. Phantasy Star looked like the way to go because RPGs were starting to become really big. So the team got back together again, and they created Phantasy Star 2. Now, it's interesting. Phantasy Star 2 is very different than Phantasy Star 1. And I remember back in the day when it got released, I was so excited for it, but in a way I didn't know what to make of it because it was such a departure. Now, when Phantasy Star 2 came out, there were some big changes actually. Obviously, it was on the Mega Drive. It looked a lot better than Phantasy Star 1. But one way it didn't look better, and that was combat. Now, in Phantasy Star 1, when you were fighting a monster, you had a background, like it was the ocean behind you or mountains or such. Phantasy Star 2 just had a grid background. There was nothing to see. And it was like, wow, this doesn't look as good. The reason why is because, this is what I hear, is they were trying to save room on the actual card. The card at the time was huge. It was 6 megs, which is nothing. Phantasy Star 1 was 4 megs. But they were trying to keep the memory size down, so they got rid of all the backgrounds that they were planning. Now, another change was, in number 1, one of the coolest things in Phantasy Star 1 were the 3D dungeons at the time. That was like nothing else. And I was so excited to see that in number 2. Well, I didn't get it. There wasn't that in number 2. There was overhead dungeons. And man, these dungeons were really hard. They were really, really tough to get through. I'm telling you. And actually, Phantasy Star comes with its own hint book that actually came with the game. Because I think Sega was so afraid that people would be a little overwhelmed by this game. Because there wasn't many RPGs and consoles, in fact at all, that were as highly deep and complicated as Phantasy Star 2 was when it came out. So I enjoyed Phantasy Star 2. There was so much cool stuff going on. And then something happens to the series. Something hugely debatable by people. Most people hate Phantasy Star 3. If you read any review out there, or you talk to anybody, everybody will say that Phantasy Star 3 sucks. Now, I bought it day 1 when it first got released, and it paled in comparison to the first 2. It wasn't as good. But you know what? And I'll be the first person I think has ever said this about it. There's some interesting things in Phantasy Star 3. Am I telling you to go and play this game right now? No. It is kind of boring. But should I ruin something? Hell, why not? Do you know what, guys? If you don't want to know the story of Phantasy Star 3 here, just take off. It's interesting. It's all these different kingdoms. And then all of a sudden, this is the coolest bit in the game. All of a sudden you realize that you're on a gigantic spaceship. that you're not in all these kingdoms, and that was a huge revelation for me at the end of playing the game. And it kind of made the game for me, because all the way through I'm playing the game, I'm like, this is kind of interesting. It's, you know, typical RPG fare. No, it wasn't as awesome as the first two. It just didn't have that magic. It was just kind of, you know, boring in a way. But when that revelation happened, that you were actually on a giant ship, that was cool. That actually made the game worth playing. And I don't know how many people talk about that. I don't know if anybody's actually ever played Phantasy Star 3. I just want to rag on it. Now, something else I want to mention. Phantasy Star 3, the reason why it was so different than the first two was because it was made by a totally different internal team at Sega. And they came in and just kind of, I guess they looked at what they had done and said, yeah, we kind of like this, but yeah, we're going to make our own game. We know what we're doing. And yeah. Now here we are at Phantasy Star 4. This game, you know, number 1 was good, number 2 was great, number 3 kind of took things south, number 4 brought it all back with Phantasy Star End of the Millennium. This game is a love letter to fans everywhere who enjoyed the original series. It just brought it back on track from the third game. It is so amazing. You know, you finally have the backgrounds back, you know, for battles. The battles were a lot more complicated. You know, you could do combo attacks. It was awesome. The backgrounds, the artwork of this game, it was really, really great. And it was so amazing that they finally ended the series. Now, this is the end of the series of the, you know, the first 4 games. It packages everything up story-wise. It's very, very fulfilling. It took everything that you liked in the first 2 games and just finally got it right. And here's something interesting. There was screenshots shown in a magazine that they were originally going to go back to Phantasy Star 1 and do the 3D dungeons. And I always thought that would have been a fascinating thing. And they didn't. They went with the overhead dungeons, and that was fine. The dungeons were really good. But it would have been really neat if they had paid homage to the first game and done the 3D dungeons. That would have been awesome.